In this video we're going to see how to set up props and weapon controllers. So here I have two bones that are part of my skeleton hierarchy. So I call them the prop joint, and they are parented to the right hand and the left hand. So I made them purple so we see them easily. Our goal is to create controls that drive those bones and controls that are able to switch between hand space, so controls following the hands, or world space, so controls following nothing, and then having effectors to snap the hands and follow the weapon. So a space switching system, essentially. First step is to create our control objects. So you can right click in the viewport, say insert, and in your asset browser drag and drop a marker, then align the marker to the bone. Okay, I'm going to make that marker a little bigger in the marker settings, and I'm going to copy paste it and align it to the other bone. Okay, so I have my two markers here, left and right. The one on the left I'm going to make blue, and the one on the right I'm going to make a vibrant green. I'm going to parent those guys to the respective hand. This time I parent to the hand FK effector. Okay, so my markers are now here. They are part of the FK effector hierarchy. I'm going to rename those. So maybe this is going to be weapon left hand. This one's going to be weapon right hand. And I'm going to duplicate those one more time. So Ctrl C, Ctrl V. And now I'm going to parent them to the reference node. So I basically have the same controls, but they are now in world space. They are not parented directly to the hands. So I'm going to call that weapon left, and then maybe a world, and this one's going to be weapon right world. And just to make things easier, I'm going to change the look of those two world space controls. I'm going to make them hot crosses and a little bigger. So for each weapon, because let's say the character has like a gun in the left hand and a gun in the right hand, I have two controls, one parented to the right hand and one parented to the reference node, so in other words, parented to the scene origin. Now I'm going to put those markers into character extensions. Right click on your character, create character extension, player extension, weapon right, and create another one, weapon left. So in the left extension I'm going to put my two controls, my two blue controls, and on the other extension I'm going to put my green controls. Okay, and pretty important when you set up extension, you want to set a reference object so that when you apply a pose, that object is posed relative to the proper object. So in my case, I want to put like the hands. I prefer to select the bone themselves. So in my weapon right extension, I'm going to assign the right hand bone, and in the other extension, I'm going to assign the left hand bone. Okay. And now I want to make sure that my right hand control drives the bone. So by default, I consider that my right hand control is my principal control. Okay, so that's why I'm going to have the bone following the right hand control. And then the second part of the system will be to have the world space control follow the main control, or have the main control follow the world space control. So that's the second part. So first we want the bone to follow the control. For that I go into my driven constraints as we saw earlier, and in my bone to control I put the bones as receivers, and in my control to bone I put my bones as senders, and vice versa for the controls themselves. So I select the controls that are parented to the hands, and in the control to bone I'm going to assign them as receivers, and in the other constraint I'm going to assign them as senders. I make sure that weapon right hand is in front of prop right and weapon left hand is in front of prop left, and I'm going to assign rotation and translation. If you know that the weapon will be scaled, you can also link the scaling, but like most of the time when you work on realistic games you wouldn't scale up a prop, so here I'm not going to link it. So I want to do the same in the other constraints. So this is the setup for my import relation constraint. So by default the control is driving the bone, right? But in the master relation, if I toggle the import mode on, the control is snapped to the bone. Now I'm going to create another constraint, relation constraint. I'm going to call it relation weapon space switch, for example. I'm going to put it here in my don't touch folder. So we're going to set it up, but later on animators won't have to worry about it. So on my controls, I'm going to add a new property. So in the properties window, editor, and then custom property. And I'm going to add an enum. So an enumeration is going to be a list of things that I can name. So in this case, I'm going to name the list weapon spacing. And in the list here, I can add the first link being right hand. And maybe the second link will be world. Okay, can copy that. And I'm going to do the same on the other control. Okay, so enum, custom properties, left hand, add an enum, rename it weapon spacing, and I can paste that in here. I'm going to change that to left hand. So by default the entry is going to be left hand, but I can change it to world. And that property now appeared here on my custom properties. So I have weapon spacing, and it's right hand or world. Okay, so this is going to drive our space switching system. And to make sure I can use that property in the relation constraint, I need to make it animatable, and here animatable. So I'm going to select those two objects and send them here as senders. So I can now use that property to drive some logic. And now I need to create certain constraints to have either the world space control following the right hand space control, or have the right hand space control following the world space control. So you could create regular parent and child constraints and have one where the right hand space control is the parent and the other control is the child, and in the other constraints vice versa. But here, I already have two controls for the right hand weapon and two controls for the left hand weapon. So it can easily escalate if you need more spaces, if you need another control that's parented to the chest or to the hips. So instead of using parent-child constraints, or just normal constraints, I'm going to use the multi-referential constraint, which is very powerful. So I'm going to call it weapon right multi-ref, and I'm going to create a second one called weapon left multi-ref. And those I'm going to put in a temp folder that's easier to access if animators need to update those constraints themselves and add more objects for adding more spaces. In the right constraint, I'm going to add the first object, the right hand, and I'm going to add, make sure those are snapped and on the same spot. And I'm going to add the world space as a second rigid object. Same in the other ref, so I make sure I select first the right hand space control, and then I select the world hand space control. So you want the order of your objects here to match the order of your enum that you created. So my first object is the left hand control, and the second object is the world space control. So you can snap those constraints, and you don't want to lock them in this case, because you want to be able to grab any object and move them around. So if I grab the right hand space control and I move, the other one follows, and if I select the world space control and I move, the other one follows. And when I select those constraints, in the properties I see multi-referential settings and I have active reference, and this can change on the fly. So what I want is driving this option with the enum that I created on my control here. So back into the weapon space relation constraint where the magic will happen, I will drag and drop as receiver the multi-referential constraints that I just created. And I can just directly link the enum here, up, and I'm going to do the same here, link the enum. Okay? And now, just so it's easier for animators, in the master relation, I'm also going to add those two controls that I have here as receivers. And here you can see the weapon spacing enum appears, so I can set a value, and so here when I animate I just have to worry about this master relation constraint. I forget about the rest. I just work here and I can switch my spacing here. Now to make things a bit easier, in the weapon space relation, I can also add both controls as receivers, and I can make sure the visibility is animatable. So now I can toggle the visibility on and off based on the enum that I chose. So if I put everything in front, so I can use a number. I'm going to check if the enum is equal to a certain number. So if my enum weapon spacing is equal 0, that means I'm in left hand space, because you need to understand that the enum that we have here, those are a list of names, left hand, world, but it corresponds to a number. The first item in the list is 0, the second item in the list is 1, and so on. So it's like an integer, okay? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So by default, when my enum is left hand, that number that gets output here is 0. So if my number A is equal 0, that means I'm in left hand space. In this case, I want the visibility of my left hand space controller to be active. Then I'm going to duplicate that node and I'm going to change that number to 1, next item in the list, and this time I'm going to plug that in my older control, and you see what's going to happen here in the viewport. My world space control disappeared, and if I change the option here in the master relation, up, it switches. This way I only have to worry about one control at a time, because I just need to see the control that corresponds to my active spacing. So that's why I do that, make things a little easier. So let's go back and do the same for the other control in the other hand. Just going to duplicate everything, link to the other anim, disconnect, link, right click, disconnect, and plug to visibility. Okay. I want to make sure that in my relation controllers to bound, so when I import an animation, I want to make sure my world space controls also get baked. So I'm going to add those as receivers, just as a safety. Okay, but I don't need to do the same here in the bound to controller constraint, because here I just say that the bone should follow the right hand space controller, and even if I'm animating in world space, the right hand space control is still exactly where the world space control is. They're always on the same spot at the same time, so I don't need to worry about this. So we're starting to have a nice space switching system where by default the control follows the right hand, and if I switch the space, I have another control that this time doesn't follow the right hand. And because those controls are part of the same character extension, as an animator I can easily key those in full body or in a body part, or bake my animation and then switch and work this way. Now what we want to do is having the option, when we are in world space, to have the hand follow the weapon, right? For this we're going to use auxiliary effectors, so you can right click on your wrist here and say create auxiliary effector, do it for both hands. Okay, we're going to change the look of those effectors, because when you have them it's hard to select the IK effector underneath. So change in the marker settings to hot cross and maybe expand that, and we want to add those effectors to extensions. So I'm going to have this one in the weapon right, I'm going to have this one in the weapon left. Okay, so they're now part of my character, so when I bake they're going to get baked as well. And I want to make sure they're parented to the world space object. Good. Maybe rename those. I like to call them left hand IK, that's a bit shorter. Right hand IK. Now again, I want an automatic option that lets me toggle on and off this IK system. Like right now it's following, but I want to be able to quickly turn it on and off. So I want to create two parent constraints, and I'm going to call it left hand IK bake, and the other one will be right hand IK bake. And I'm going to have, in those constraints, I'm going to have the auxiliary effector constraint to the IK effector. So it's similar to the hips effector system that we have. I'm going to zero out those constraints, and as always I'm going to set the weight to animatable. So by default my auxiliary effector is following the IK effector, which means that it does nothing, right? Even if I move here, it does nothing. Even though the IK blind translation is set to 100%, I can leave that on at all time. What matters is having this constraint set to 0, and in this case the effector is driving. So I can move those constraints to the driven constraints folder, and on my controls here I'm going to add a new custom property. So editor, custom property, boolean this time, up, and I'm going to call it hand IK. So when this option will be on, it means the hand will follow the weapon in IK. If you want to rename a created custom property, you can always do it here. Okay, make sure they are animatable. And now in the master relation, we can activate them. Set value, right click, set value, so the animators are free to come and toggle this on and off. But this doesn't do anything yet. In the weapon space switch system, we need to add some logic. So here we have the right hand IK boolean showing up. We want to drag and drop our left hand IK bake constraints as receivers. Receivers, I see the weight showing up because the weight is animatable here. So when this option is on, we want the bake to be at 0, and when it's off, we want it to be at 100%. So I just need to go in numbers and say if condition, then A, else B. So if my condition is true, I want the baking to be at 0, and if it's false, I want the baking to be at 100%, like it is by default. You can copy paste that here, up, reconnect, and connect here. So now, by default, it doesn't follow. The auxiliary effector isn't driving the core IK. But if I turn the option on, the auxiliary effector is following. Of course, when I activate that, I need to make sure that my IK effector doesn't have any IK blind, otherwise they are kind of fighting each other. But I don't want to drive this with an option, because maybe animators need to toggle that on and off, because maybe the character is putting one hand on the floor. So I just want to leave that responsibility to animators to make sure they toggle that off. Let's make sure it works on both sides. Okay. And of course, animators should know that when they turn that option on, they should be in wall space here. If they turn it on while this is in left-hand space, I mean, they can, but it's gonna give odd results because both objects are trying to follow each other. Last thing we want to do is drive the visibility of that auxiliary effector. So if you select both of them and set the visibility to animatable, so take a little bit of space here, take the effectors, drop them as receivers. Here I have my left hand, here I have my right hand. And in this case, we want the visibility to be on when the IK is true, so we can just plug directly the visibility, and here as well. Back in the master relation, by default I don't see the auxiliary effectors, but if I turn the option on, they show up. This way it's easier for me to be sure, like in the blink of an eye, I quickly see in which mode I am. So all my controls are set up nicely. I have my space switching system. The only thing I'm missing now is a weapon model. So I'm going to merge an FBX in my scene. So I selected an FBX and I'm only going to choose the models. So I have this carbine showing up here. First thing I'm going to do is add it to my meshes group. and deselect pick transform. This way I can't select it by accident. And usually I would directly constrain that model to the bone, but maybe you have a lot of different weapons in your scene, right? Maybe you have a sword, maybe you have this rifle. So instead, I prefer to create a null that I parent to models here, to my models group, and I'm going to call it weapon right hand. Oh, there's a name conflict because that's the same name as my controller here. Now that we're done with the controllers, we can select them all and maybe add a namespace player control, so they have the same namespace as every other controller. So weapon right hand. Make sure that null is invisible. We don't need to see it. And duplicate it. Make another group if you need weapons in the left hand. So maybe a secondary sword, a dagger, another pistol, whatever. And I'm going to parent that carbine model to that group here and maybe align it as well. Okay. And finally, in my constraints and my base relation, I'm just going to take those two nulls that I created and put them as receivers. And I'm going to take my bones, left and right, and set them as senders. Make sure right is in front of right, left is in front of left, and link rotation and translation. So now my weapon is following my bone one-on-one, and I know that at all time what I see here is exactly what I'm going to get in the engine. So there's no offset between the prop and my null. I don't want any weird like 90 degrees rotation or anything like that. I want to make sure that I animate the props properly, because in the engine you're going to probably snap the weapon model to those prop joints, right? So now if I want to animate, I want to animate on the controllers and rotate the controllers so they are well aligned with the hands, etc. But that's the animator's job. Like as riggers, we made sure that there wasn't any weird offset. And worst case scenario, if I import a weapon that has a weird rotation, I can always, rotate the weapon here in the group, but at least I don't mess up the other weapons, right? So if if this weapon has a weird offset like that and I need to counter this, I can always, zero it out or figure it out here. But my group is still like one-on-one aligned with the bone and with the controller. And because I want to make your life easier, of course I prepared a template scene that has exactly the same setup. So I have a weapon relation constraint with the space switching setup. I have the multi-referential constraints. I have the controls already set and already assigned to character extensions. So you just need to assign your character as the attached character. And if you merge that scene into your character scene, in the base relation, you just have to add your weapon bones here as senders and plug them into the weapon models. And the weapon models nulls are here, and you can just parent your weapon models to those nulls. And then you would have to create the auxiliary effectors for both hands and parent those to the world space controls.